the Delhi High Court. So before I dive into the meatier portion, I'll just outline why are we studying this. So there's been a very recent judgment of the Delhi High Court last year, which has very, very interestingly directed the Law Commission of India to consider whether we need to amend the Indian Penal Code and add a section on genocide, okay, on criminalizing genocides. So this is a particularly important topic today because we're often asked our views as lawyers. So Law Commission is looking for public international law consultants to talk about this particular issue, okay, which is why we're looking. So this is the 1984 Sikh Riot Sajjan Kumar judgment, which is constantly in. Now it's been doing the circles when it came to the news because certain witnesses turned hostile and there's evidence which was being recorded, etc. So we'll come to all those meaty issues in a minute, okay? So essentially, international crime or international criminal law is that body of law which basically punishes the perpetrator of the crime or the executor of the crime or the committer of the crime in his individual personal liability. Because technically, we have state responsibility in international humanitarian law. We have ICJ and we have public international law, which develops and fosters relationships between states. Okay. Rahul says, sorry to interrupt. Could you please go a bit slow? Sure. What I'm trying to explain is that international crime as a body of law, and I will do all those portions of Sajjan Kumar in a minute. So I just wrapped that up as introduction to give you. So you can just hear that, but not probably make a note of it, except for the fact that there has been a development in Indian criminal law with respect to the High Court asking us to fill a gap in our Indian Penal Code because there is no section for genocide. It's missing. We don't have that as a separate inchoate crime. Okay? We have murder, we have criminal conspiracy, we have attempt to murder, but we don't have it as a separate section. Okay? The sources of international criminal law are identical to the sources of public international law. So exactly like what Article 38 of the ICJ statute did for public international law, exactly the same thing we follow in ICL. Ditto. So treaty, custom, general principles of international law, Martin's clause, the same. Can you not hear me? Someone says they can't hear me. Mana Gupta. Am I audible, guys? Am I audible to everyone? Can one of you just let me know?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So
Yes, ma'am.
I'm guessing that you'd have to figure it out. So
Yes,
I think
ma'am.
you just take that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I think a few people are finding it difficult. Okay, anyway. So thank you. So POAKANDE, okay, Dapo Akande. You must have a go at this particular article. I will circulate it if I can find time, and that talks about the sources of ICL. I'll send it to Ashwini and I'll ask him to circulate to everyone, okay? So that's a brilliant article when it comes to sources of international criminal law. He compares it with PIL, okay? So this particular article, which is there. Okay, now come to substantive law, okay? So substantive law, when it comes to crimes, is of particular importance to us, okay? When you come to crimes and the law of international crimes,
Ma'am, I can't
request everyone
hear,
to-
ma'am. It's
Yes.
breaking, ma'am.
What is breaking? My voice is breaking. Well, I request you to not punch on the chat bubble, Ritika, again and again. Just hang in there. Probably if there's a doubt, we can come back to it, okay? So that's very distracting for me as a speaker. I will repeat the name of the article nevertheless. Is my voice a little clearer now? This is the only difficulty with Cisco,
Yes,
because the
ma'am.
bandwidth that it requires is for everybody to have a good internet. So I'm sustained on a 5G, so I'm fine. But it's going to be a little bit of a problem, so you have to manage. Okay. In any case, I think we're recording the session. So in case anyone misses out something particular, don't worry. I think we'll have a recorded version, hopefully. Okay. Yes, so she was asking me the name of the article. I will just punch that down for you. The article is Dapo Akande. Okay. So this is Dapo's article on sources of ICL. Okay. I'll have it sent to you in any case. Okay. It's sitting in the Antonio Cassesi's book. I'll send it to you in any way. Antonio Cassesi. Check the spelling later. So there are certain substantive crimes, okay, which are particularly prosecuted in an international criminal law case. So this is different, okay? This canvas is very different from domestic penal law. How do you have this canvas of international criminal law? You have war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocides, aggression. Okay, so all these different types of crimes are there, which are substantively punishable. Okay, as per what we call, which is the Rome Statute. Okay, so this is a treaty, and this is what you need to know as lawyers today have an opinion on international criminal law, that there's a treaty in place called the Rome Statute. Okay, this treaty talks about states coming together and setting up an international criminal court, which is permanent in nature. Okay, and this permanent court is going to be prospective. So it's going to come out with punishing anybody and everybody who commits genocide 2002 onwards, 1st July 2002. So that's my cutoff date. Okay. So if a Rohingyan issue happens, can I take the leader of Myanmar, okay, or the government authorities of Myanmar in their own personal capacity? Can I drag them to the International Criminal Court? When I drag Myanmar as a state for genocide, then I'm going to the ICJ because that has a state responsibility. But if I want to go to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, then can I drag Myanmarian governmental authorities, the president, the prime minister, someone in control? So it's like, can a company be prosecuted? Yes, can be. Who do I actually go to? The director, the brainchild. So it's literally like that, okay? You have a state, you have a country. State is obviously country in public international law. So you drag the leaders or the authoritarian or the militia leaders of the particular state who have been in control. So an excellent series that I ask everyone to watch is the series on Netflix called Tokyo Trials, okay? It's an excellent watch on international criminal law. And probably when we have time, we can do another webinar on this concept of Nuremberg trials, where I can introduce this better to you. But right now we need to jump on to genocide. And this is usually a subject I teach over 6 months, okay? So I'm going to try and squeeze in as much info about genocide as I can. So bear with me if I go a bit faster. Yeah? There is a principle of legality in international criminal law, which is very crucial. Legality means two things, okay, in public international law as a lawyer to us. Legality means clarity and it means non-retroactivity, okay? So a penal statute, a criminal law statute has to be clear. There has to be a strict interpretation ki bhai ye 4 ingredients hai, we are going to prosecute by these 4 ingredients only. So legality is a very, very important principle of public international law as well as international criminal law, okay? So you have a cutoff date, which is for the ICC, which is my date of 2002, that whatever genocidal crimes will occur after 2002 will be tried by the ICC. In case you have the jurisdiction factor completed, that's a separate discussion, but not going into that discussion, assuming that to be there, this is the case, okay? So prospective or non-retroactivity, and secondly, clarity, okay? Specificity, the law has to be specific. Accused should know that he is being punished for this particular crime, which is penal in nature. But the process of legality fails for genocide. Why? Because genocide has been declared as a jus cogens, okay? Today, genocides have been declared, they have been, you cannot commit a genocide irrespective of the fact that whether you as a country are a signatory to the Genocide Convention or not. So if Myanmar, where it's killing any sort of Muslims who are present, Burmese Muslims who are present, to throw them out from Myanmar or Burma, then in that situation, even if Myanmar hasn't signed the GC, the Genocide Convention 1948, which defines and penalizes genocide internationally, even then that country is bound to not do a genocide or allow the commission of a genocide in their country because it's a jus cogens. It's a non-derogable norm. That means you are presumed to have clarity and knowledge about this law. So in jus cogens, as a country, you don't need to sign the treaty. It's understood कि आप ये नहीं कर सकते. अगर आप ये करोगे, you will be in breach of your international law obligation. You cannot do it as a state. Okay, so genocide is, that's why, very peculiar for us as a country like India. Okay, because we honor international obligations. We want a seat, a permanent seat at the UN. We're looking at all sorts of international space and footings. And one of the ballpark milestones for that particular international jump could very well be the Rome Statute, and India intervened because when Rome Statute was being deliberated upon, India chose not to vote. We haven't signed the Rome Statute as well, but we chose to not even cast a vote. So we didn't agree whether we need the Rome Statute, whether we don't need the Rome Statute. So technically, we didn't have a stand on it. Okay, we were neutral. Basically, we were neutral. Okay, right. I quickly want to come to this, that genocide is often called the crime of crimes. Okay, so there's an author called William Shabas, and he calls genocide the crime of crimes. There was a UNGA resolution 96/1, okay, which essentially spoke about genocidal norms, and it spoke about the denial of the right of existence of the entire human group, okay? And it said that this is homicide, which is denial of right to life. So technically, it's flowing from Article 21 for us, okay? So this criminal trial also has a consti law angle. I'm not just looking at the Indian Penal Code being deficit, okay? We are looking at the Indian Penal Code needing an amendment to the extent of adding a separate section saying genocide or mass murders will be punishable with death penalty. We don't have that in our IPC. That's a gap in law. And that gap in law will be filled in once the legislature amends it, or we use some sort of customary backup, which is something we always use to fill in the gap, because it's a jus cogens. Even if you are not signatory to the Rome Statute and your country is committing genocide, you are bound to take cognizance of it. Otherwise, the international law will walk in. It's as simple as that. So if Godhra riots happen, if anti-Sikh riots happen, if Modi doesn't stop the Godhra riots, there's a huge problem, because even though we may not have signed the Rome Statute, we still are in derogation of a jus cogens called genocide, which is mandatorily to be prevented and punished for in any country, irrespective of whether it has signed the GC or not. That's the canvas first you need to keep in mind. Okay, clear to everyone? Now I'm moving ahead to telling you that there are two kinds of substantive crimes in international law. Okay, you have genocide and you have a crime against humanity. These are two different things. Okay, these two concepts, and this is one clarity that you need to have, because everywhere we label them as CH, but we don't call them genocides. And then there is something called ethnic cleansing. Okay, let's look at all of this. This is interesting because most of the time, and yes, there's one more thing, something called a communal riot. This is of particular interest after CAA issue walking in, okay, NRC walking in. This is of particular interest to us as lawyers. कहाँ पे किसकी line खत्म होती है और कहाँ कौन सी शुरू होती है becomes very interesting, because you need to know, as an international law expert or somebody well versed with criminal law, you need to have an opinion that either what's happening in Delhi is a communal riot, is the Rohingya issue a mere ethnic cleansing, or has it achieved the status of CAH, crime against humanity, or has it become genocidal in nature? So look at the hierarchy. The hierarchy is exactly like how I've written it. सबसे नीचे communal riot है, least intensity. Then you have ethnic cleansing, a little above, or probably I could keep ethnic cleansing and communal rights together in a way. Then I have crime against humanity, CAH, and then right on top of the prism sits genocide. Okay, so genocide is the crime of crimes, literally. Okay, now genocide basically is of peculiar interest to us, because genocide means that we are targeting a specific group with a mens rea to completely destroy the group in whole or a substantial part of it. Okay, I'm repeating that. Genocide means that the intent is a specific intent called dolus specialis. Dolus specialis. Dolus specialis is peculiar to the crime of genocide, and its job is to punish and prosecute when there is an animus, when there is a mens rea, to specifically eliminate a group. Muslims ko hatana hai. That is an animus, to eliminate that group. You go and you burn down houses indiscriminately. Okay, but you go and check that is this a Muslim occupied or a Muslim owned house? Burn it down, leave the Hindu house untouched. This is a specific intent. The evidence is gathered from the direct and the circumstantial evidence available. Okay, so very interesting for our discussion as lawyers. So this is when you will mold the investigative material. There's a body within the ICC structure, International Criminal Court structure, which is called the OTP, Office of the Prosecutor. In India, in our domestic law, we have IO, investigating officer, who investigates and collects the material to formulate a charge sheet. In ICC, OTP सारी investigation करता है. Prosecutor himself investigates. So it's a beautiful mix of civil and common law. It's not the police which investigates. It's the office of the prosecutor which personally investigates whether the genocidal crimes have occurred or not. And there is a pre-trial chamber hearing, PTC. One PTC hearing is that PTC hearing is to determine whether that OTP material is enough to invoke the particular Rome Statute article, that substantive law article of crimes against humanity, of genocide, etc., etc. Okay, so that hearing occurs, and once that's done, then the matter goes to the TC, trial chamber, and then it goes to the AC, appeals chamber. Okay, if required, if someone appeals. So that's the structure. You have an OTP. The OTP has a PTC hearing. Usually 3 judges sit in a PTC hearing. PTC checks the admissibility of the claim. Is it an admissible claim? Once it's said to be admissible, it's like on jurisdiction or admissibility, initial hearing. जब वो prima facie case वहां से बन जाता है, that's when it reaches trial chamber hearing, TC, and then of course they lead evidence like normal trials, like how it happens in our criminal trial, and then it goes to the appeals chamber. So the canvas is fairly similar thereafter, but this PTC hearing is peculiar in international criminal law. Just pardon my throat, I've been teaching a lot. I need to just take a minute. Yes, now I need to tell you the difference between judges in trial and appeal will vary, Chavishri. Okay, it'll vary depending on 5 or 7. It'll depend. That depends on what sort of quorum is put together by the president judge. So you have somebody also called the presidency. Usually you have 5. Normally you have 5 judges. When I was working at the MICT, we used to have MICT hearings for Karadich's appeal. Okay, so Karadich suppose had 5. Okay. There are different names of accused persons, but usually 5 is the bench, the normal bench, like Consti bench in India. Okay, like in India in Supreme Court, we need Consti bench at least 5. Okay, you're welcome. Okay, now genocide and CAH are 2 distinct concepts. Okay, they are 2 very, very distinct concepts. So in that hierarchy, if you go up as to what I had written, in that hierarchy, I first spoke about communal riots. So communal riots means it's happening internally. The state will say this is between the state and its people, like what we have maintained about Kashmir. We call it an internal armed conflict. We say Kashmir is our own baby. Naxalites, it's our own issue. It's a NIAC, non-international armed conflict. So IHL and ICL play out a lot, okay? International humanitarian law and international criminal law play out beautifully together. And that's very interesting, along with refugee law. Okay, so very, very interesting. So my work actually at the tribunal was precisely this. I used to look at a refugee claim, then look at the international humanitarian law violations, possibly human rights laws violations, and then I would give a view on the international criminal law perspective. So actually these 3 subjects are beautifully interlinked. Okay? Anyway, so all these issues in communal riots are NIACs, non-international armed conflicts. So the intensity or the threshold is lower. Now, after that, you go to ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is forced migration of people. That means I don't want to eliminate the group, but I want the group to leave from here. This is Myanmar's defense in the Rohingya issue. They say we want Muslims out of this country. We don't want to eliminate the Burmese Muslims. So this is a classic defense to genocidal claims. Defense or accused versus prosecutor. Okay, so prosecutor, like in criminal trial, we have state versus accused. Abroad, in international criminal law, we have prosecutor versus accused. That's the title of the judgment. So if Karadich's case is going on or Mladich's case is going on, then it will say prosecutor versus Karadich. Okay, so that's how they label their particular case names. We call them state versus so-and-so, accused. Okay, so in this sort of a situation, what's important to understand is that when it comes to ethnic cleansing, every time the accused will say, I didn't have the dolus specialis or the criminal mens rea of the genocide threshold to completely terminate the group. I just wanted the forced migration of people. This has been peculiarly held to be, this distinction has been peculiarly held to be true in 2 cases. I'll just give you both the names. One is Karadich and the other is Mladic. Okay, they have said that ICTY, which is the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, it has held that ethnic cleansing in these places was equal to genocide. I'll just explain in a minute. What happened was that where did this idea come to birth from? Technically, states would go at war amidst each other. World War II had happened. Cut to, there were Jews wherein there was Holocaust happening, wherein Jews were picked up. Nazis were picking up Jews and they were putting them into gas chambers, gang rapes, mass violence, killing everyone. Okay, literally indiscriminately persecuting Jews at that point in time. So Jews were that marginalized community like Muslims today. Okay, perhaps that's the analogy I can give you. That Islamophobia was almost like Jewish phobia at that point in time. So once that happened, you had the setting up of Nuremberg tribunals, okay, which were basically the powers that had won coming together, who had won the World War II, coming together. You had UK, USA, Russia coming together and formulating a tribunal called the Nuremberg Tribunal, wherein they said that we are going to come out with a separate trial for people like Hitler, etc. So they came out with a Nuremberg Charter and then they tried all these people. Everybody was held guilty. Some ran away, some were given death sentence, some were given life imprisonment, etc. etc. Cut to, after this, Tokyo Tribunal came. Similar thing happened. Japan had indiscriminately walked in everywhere. Okay, ditto, same thing happened. And then Japanese were tried. Japanese soldiers, Japanese leaders were tried, okay, by China, Indonesia. So Tokyo trials is that little bit. And it's very sad now, but Irfan Khan acts as the Indian judge in that Netflix series who goes on the panel, Justice Ruma Pal, okay? Very interesting. So you guys must watch that when you have time. It's a little boring. It's a little boring in the beginning, but it picks up. And legally, it's a very sound show, okay? So that tells you that internationally, we didn't have a criminal law earlier to prosecute individuals. We could prosecute states in public international law. But how could we hold a leader of a state personally liable under international law obligation? It was unheard of. Everyone said, we are not going to give up our state sovereignty. It's precious to us. So that's how they developed this particular aspect of international criminal law. So now there's a proper law. There's a mandate coming from a treaty. This body has been crystallized today. And in the meanwhile, what had happened was that there was a Yugoslavian war in the 1990s, which we call the Balkan War. So this is why I'm telling you the story, because it's important to know the legacy. Because when we read Rome Statute, that's when we are going to read all sorts of precedents coming from ICTY and ICTR. You can just note these two terminologies down. Good Simran, could you please justify why Nuremberg trial is called victor's justice? Okay, I can do that if I can share screen. I will like to share screen a slide with you. I think I can actually have a brilliant slide which I can take you to, but that's not exactly technically my topic of discussion. But because you asked a brilliant question, I will take you to it in a second. Just a minute. Okay, so go to. Okay, so I usually teach this over 6 months, and I wanted to teach in your law school, but your college has so many hiccups to go through that I was not able to get through this. And I really wanted to teach ICR because it's my area of major, and I teach in so many colleges, and for some reason I can't give back to my own. Okay? So we'll see if we can coordinate something with Ashwini on this. Yes. Can you see the screen, everyone? Is the screen visible? One of you can tell me.
Yes, ma'am, it's available.
Okay. So Gur Simran has asked me the question about Nuremberg trials. Okay, and let's take that quickly from here. What happened was that Nuremberg trials was that entire patch which I was telling you about how Nuremberg, which was an aftermath of the World War II, was a tribunal which was set up. And let's take you from here. This will become clear. Yeah. So that's what the Nuremberg proceedings looked like. And almost all these persons were basically German officials, okay, leading German officials who were tried for all these post-war crimes that had happened. And you had 4 allied nations who'd run literally the reins of the war and won, which is what I was telling you, USA, UK, Russia, and France. They actually set up a tribunal. So it was almost like the Victor's Justice Tribunal. We call it the Victor's Justice in law because it was the persons who were victorious had already decided in their minds that they are going to hold all these Nazi people who had lost the World War II liable criminally in their personal capacity because of the fact that it was a victor's justice, classic case of injustice. So Nuremberg trials are criticized, heavily criticized. Why? Because it was almost like the winner had decided that now I'm going to prosecute all these persons, and they were looking for a reason for doing so. Let's just see in a minute what I'm saying. So what happened was that there were 8 judges. All 8 judges were basically from the Allied powers. You didn't have a single representation from the Axis powers. So number one criticism, there was not a single German judge or a neutral country judge. It was all the victorious powers who had made their own judges sit on the tribunal. So problem one, Victor's justice, problem number one, Gursimran. Second problem, you had an indictment wherein you were trying to come up with specific charges. You had no basis for those charges. You didn't have a tribunal trial charter in place, nothing. You had a state responsibility, but you didn't have an international criminal personal responsibility. So accused technically was in breach of legality. Defense argued that we didn't know we are being tried for what? We knew that committing murder and conspiracy is a crime in German law. But is that a crime in public international law because I'm the head of militia? Because I am a president or a prime minister head? It was not a separate crime back then. Charter and the tribunal came much later after the World War got over, and the crimes were retrospective. So after the commission of the crime, you make a law. It should be a penal offense as on date of commission of crime. You can apply that law to a particular criminal matter which is in place on the date of commission of crime, legality. So this is another criticism of Nuremberg trials, that it hit legality. You had a trial which was retrospective in nature. After they won the war, they created a tribunal and then they said backdate में जो World War II में जो persecutions किए Jews के against, उसके लिए prosecute करेंगे, लेकिन उसका charter हम बाद में बनाएंगे, टेबल पे बैठ के जब हम war जीत गए. How is that possible? It's absurd. So when the crime was being committed, when the persecution was being committed, it was not a criminal law, it was not a penal statute in international law that all these heads of states are going to be personally held criminally liable with responsibility attributed to them for the commission of these particular substantive war crimes. That charter came much later. Second problem of Victor's justice, okay? Third problem, all of the defense lawyers who were German, there was no equality of arms. That means they were not given the same resources to fight the war in terms of the war trial hearings. So you had a German judge who didn't have resources to those particular legal material, etc., and information or the charter provisions, which were otherwise available to all sorts of prosecutors who were available. So accused or defense, principle of natural justice followed. Okay. Then I think my voice is echoing. So this was principle of legality, ex post facto legislation. I've told you this. Okay, so this was a huge problem. Tribunal responded by saying there has been a Pact of Paris. Okay, there has been a Kellogg-Briand Pact wherein you were understood to have known that states cannot use force or power. Okay, and that is why this sort of war crime being an international criminal obligation, you use custom to fill in the gap. So this was a particular way of the tribunal coming to terms with this. Golmol, very vague answer, doesn't make sense legally. Nuremberg heavily criticized. Complete victor's justice. जो victory में आ गया, उसने अपने आप को show करने के लिए कि मैंने justice दिया है. It went around this entire subverted process. Second problem, the affirmation, okay, which was done, that they actually said that at the end of the day, states don't commit crimes. States are abstract entities. They are headed by individuals who have minds, who have duties, and those particular minds are actually transcending their national boundaries and formulating international obligations. So that was the tribunal's answer. Why is it called victor's justice, Gursimran? Judges were biased, first of all. You had all judges from the winners, okay, from the Allied powers. You didn't have a single German judge or the Axis power judge. Number two, the applicable law. It was actually a law which was known to guarantee conviction in a way because it was made later, after it was actually committed. Secondly, there was a principle of tu quo quo. In international law, you can make a note of this, guys. This is new for you. There is a principle in public international law, and especially international criminal law, which is called principle of tu quo quo. It's on the slide, bottom right. This particular principle, it's right here. Yeah, tu quo quo. This particular principle is argued that the same act which was done by the other side was not technically punished for. So the same persecutions which were done by the allied powers were not punished for. So inequality in justice. So all of that was a problem with the Nuremberg trials. Okay, and today they are called a trial of atrocities. Okay, so yes. How do I go back? Stop sharing. Okay, so Gursimran, I think I've answered your query in real great detail. Not that I was intending to do this today. And that's when I've done that, okay? So, Gursimran, is it clear? Why is the country reluctant to be a part of the Rome Statute? Go and read my article. It's published in NLU Delhi Peer Review Journal. It's freely available. Rahul Prasad, okay? Just Google Shriya, NLU Delhi, and my article exactly talks about this, why India isn't signing the Rome Statute. Okay, I have proposed that it should be. Okay, so that's your task, because if I get into that query, either I take it after I teach a bit, okay, or we can have another webinar, or I can take it at the end of this webinar. But let me just go through a little with the course of what we've intended to do today. Okay. Yes. So we were discussing about where was I? What was I last talking substantively to you? Can someone tell me?
ICTY and ICTR.
So thank you so much. So ICTY and ICTR were two tribunals. They were basically United Nations tribunals, which were set up in the 1990s, essentially. And ICTY is International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, okay? And ICTR is International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So Yugoslavia actually had a war crime issue. Yugoslavia was a huge country, and then there was a war like USSR, Soviet Union, and it split up into numerous tiny bits. And on the other hand, Rwanda had the genocidal issue between two groups called Hutus and Tutsis. So essentially, there were two tribunals which were set up by the United Nations. Okay, one was called International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, ICTY, and the other was called International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. They were functus officio, both of them. Okay, functus officio. By now, the world had realized. So this is a very latest development, everyone. We're talking about literally 1990s, guys, like very recently. So 1990s, the world has realized that war crimes are the new thing, okay? Countries are engaging into war. It's a power play. It's a game. So because of this realization, they set up these tribunals. So United Nations walked in, breach of peace and security, Chapter 7 violation. UNSC sets up these bodies. Now these bodies are of particular interest because for the first time, you had specific ICTY charter, ICTR charter, which gave birth to some sort of judicial precedent of ICTY and ICTR, which are the basis for what I call today the ICC. So basically, I have ICTY, which also was followed by ICTR, and then I have ICC. Now, what's the difference? ICC is a permanent body. Mandate comes from Rome Statute. ICTY and ICTR have been replaced by ICC today. They have been functus officio. That job got over. Once Yugoslavian matters were all tried, all the criminals and accused, allegedly people who were alleged of war crimes were tried, that's done, ICTY. Once in Rwanda, all those who had committed genocide, all those Hutus were punished, done with, functus officio, like an arbitral tribunal. Your mandate is over, you've rendered the award, functus officio, done with, over. So in this situation, tomorrow if there's a genocidal crime or a war crime, who will try? We don't have a tribunal. So who created that tribunal? Rome Statute. Okay. Now let's come back to genocide. So this is important to know. So today, if there's a genocide in the world, you need to first check if that particular country is a signatory to the Rome Statute or not, where the genocide is happening. Okay, that's what you need to check. I request everybody to mute themselves, especially Mana Gupta. Mana Gupta. You need to mute yourselves, please. Mana Gupta 6. I think you're unmuted and that's causing disturbance to everyone in the class. Thank you. So, yes. So, thank you. And please keep yourself unmuted, muted, please. So when you talk about genocides, guys, genocide is very essential because today you need to check the first thing is the country signatory to the Rome Statute. For instance, in Rohingyas, in Myanmar, in Burma, Myanmar is not a signatory to the Genocide Convention and thereafter the Rome Statute. So technically, ICC cannot walk in. I'll just give you an example. Understand the scheme. So there is something called complementarity. Okay? Note this down. I'll just explain what this is. There is a doctrine on which the Rome Statute is based, which is the basis for international criminal law. Okay? Complementarity doctrine. This is called the unable to or unwilling to doctrine. Can someone explain this? Anyone? Anyone wants to take a try? Simple. Unable to or unwilling to. Anyone? Quickly. Go on, Kavita. Gursimran, go for it. You guys can. You cannot answer. Can you not answer? Is it? Have we muted you? Okay, yeah. One of you can answer. That's fine.
Oh,
You have
hi.
muted.
This is Kavita.
Hi.
So,
Yes.
as per my understanding of the unable and unwilling test, is that when a country is first of all unwilling to go ahead and take any measures or any action against a particular perpetrator, and similarly unable would be that when you don't have the particular resources and means to go ahead and prosecute a perpetrator. I mean, that's my understanding.
So,
Thank you.
yeah. So that's a good broad picture. Anyone wants to add anything to it? Okay. So I think I can take it from here. So essentially, there is a limited jurisdiction concept. Okay, so there is a concept in international criminal law, which is crucial because it's different from penal law. This criminal trial rests on the issue of complementarity doctrine. Okay, so technically, when you look at the Rome Statute, you need to go to Article 17 of the Rome Statute, guys. Today. That's what I'm teaching you, the law applicable today. That's most important to understand. So you need to go to Article 17 of the Rome Statute, wherein it's clearly written that the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which sits at The Hague, is going to be supplementary and not supplanting in nature. It means states are going to retain the first right of trying their own nationals. So if there is a genocide in Myanmar, they are killing the Rohingyan Muslims, then in that situation, Myanmar as a country has a first right to try its own leaders who are perpetuating that genocide or stopping the commission thereof in their own country. So states have the prime ability and responsibility to be able to try their own nationals who have allegedly committed that crime of genocide. Now, this was a compromise on the basis of which the states had agreed to become a part of the Rome Statute, because every state holds state sovereignty to its chest. It says, मैं state sovereignty क्यों दूं? मैं एक international court को power क्यों दूं? मेरे courts पे आके rule करने के लिए. I'm going to try my own national, no difficulty. Why should I give the International Criminal Court a power to do it? So this was one of the reasons why most of the countries were not signing the Rome Statute. So a compromise was effectuated. It was a trade-off. So ICC or Rome Statute said, look, come and sign this particular treaty. We will let the first responsibility and ability remain with you. So only if you as a country are unable or unwilling to try your own national for the alleged crime that has occurred, will the ICC walk in. Now, what is this unable to or unwilling? I'll just quickly give you the law so you can make the notes. Unwilling to means three things. Okay, when someone says a country is unwilling to try, what does this mean? Number one, the country is shielding the accused. Something like what has been argued at length in Judge Loya's case. Okay, constantly shielding the accused persons. You are not letting the truth come out. What has been argued in Godra Rayat's case. You are not letting the truth come out. Okay, Chavishri has asked me about ICC taking suo motu cognizance. Just hold on to that question. I'll just talk about the jurisdiction in a minute. Okay, in a minute. Let me just finish this and then I'll come to this. Just 2 minutes. The next thing is unjustified delay. Okay. So second thing, guys, don't write on the chat bubble for literally a minute. Let me just write the points together. Otherwise, I will get confused. So the first is shielding the accused. Second is unjustified delay. And the third is not an independent tribunal. Okay. Third is not an independent or impartial tribunal. This is what unwilling to means as per Article 17, subclause 1 of the Rome Statute. Now, what does this mean? When someone is shielding, this means you have to wait for the end of the trial. So it's a subjective analysis. How will we come to know they are shielding? You will have to look at the motive aspect. What could it be? It could be a political motive. It could be a personal motive. It could be a financial motive of the country, etc., etc. So you have to see the authorities, legislature, judiciary, executive, how have they acted? Okay, all of this. Very subjective, very difficult to prove. Onus on the prosecutor is very high to prove. Secondly, unjustified delay. Okay, unjustified delay, second and third, not an independent tribunal. These are objective factors, comparatively easier to prove. Okay, mere closure of investigation, however, is not unjustified. Okay, or not independent tribunal or shielding. Mere closure. So somewhere near closure happens, that by itself cannot be. You have to show something more. Okay, plus factors. So the burden of proof here on the prosecutor who's alleging that ICC should assume jurisdiction because country is unwilling to try is very, very high, very difficult to prove. And no country would want to lose its sovereignty and ability to try. So it will say, I am willing to try and I'm able to try and I'm trying. You keep out as the ICC. Second is the second test, which I told you, is unable to try. Okay, so the second thing which Kavita also said is unable to try. Now, what is unable to try? When there is a total or substantial collapse of the national judiciary. Okay, so if the national mechanism is in collapse, total collapse, this has been one of the major prime reasons why African countries have been a victim of the ICC regime. You'll constantly see this in news articles that ICC has assumed jurisdiction, ICC has assumed jurisdiction. So, Chavishri, that suo motu jurisdiction comes from this para, unable to. So they prove in that pre-trial chamber hearing that the prosecutor proves there that, look, there is a trigger mechanism in the Rome Statute wherein prosecutor, like a PIL is filed in our court, a prosecutor, if he gets information from anywhere, third country, newspaper, Amnesty International report, that there are stark human rights violations in Rwanda, in Tanzania, in Africa, he or she can assume jurisdiction if he proves that that country is unwilling to try or unable to try. Have you followed, Chavishri? So to that extent, yes, ICC has jurisdiction suo motu and UNSC reference. United Nations Security Council can also refer. Okay, so jurisdiction there. Complementarity is a claim of admissibility, guys. Whether a claim is admissible or not. So an ICC could have jurisdiction because, say for instance, Myanmar, hypothetically speaking, is a signatory. But is the country able to or unwilling to try the admissibility test? Please understand the difference. In international criminal law, there's a stark distinction between jurisdiction and admissibility. For genocidal claims, you have to prove that there is jurisdiction. How will you prove jurisdiction? Either the crime of genocide has occurred in that particular country, like Myanmar, or it is a head of a state, the state's national who's perpetrating that crime. If it's trans-border, that's also fine. So if Bangladesh is perpetrating, Sri Lanka is perpetrating LTTE, Tamilian Tigers into India. So we say state party national, that can trigger jurisdiction. These are jurisdictional issues. An ICC may have jurisdiction in all these circumstances. But when will the claim become admissible? When I show that the state is unwilling or unable to try. My complementarity as per Article 17 of the Rome Statute is a very, very important aspect of admissibility. Kavita Mohanty, Miss Many, when you get time, could you please shed a little light on the interconnection between refugee law and humanitarian law? I will do that once I take the questions, okay? So this is about complementarity and jurisdictional aspect, okay? That's important. Keep that in mind. Now come back to genocide. So basically, why have genocidal claims become important because genocide as such talks about three things. Genocides talk about the existence of a protected group. Genocide talk about mens rea, which is basically dolus specialis. And genocides also talk about actus reus, okay? In classic genocidal claims internationally, we don't have a domestic law for genocide as a separate crime. We have murder and conspiracy, which is why the Law Commission in the 1984 anti-Sikh riots judgment of the Delhi High Court, okay, in 2019, has directed that the Law Commission look into this matter and come up with a particular section criminalizing genocide. So draw inspiration from the world and the fact that it's a jus cogens. We are also a signatory to the GC, Genocide Convention 1948. You bloody well come out with a section or amend the law or say that you are going to penalize for genocide up to so-and-so number of years. Now, what are these protected groups? This is important. So protected groups are basically any sort of, and you can note it down if you want, any sort of national, ethnical, racial, or religious. Okay, any sort of national, ethnical, religious, or racial. Okay? So these are important. These are the only groups that are protected. So something like political group, okay? And the test is stable and permanent, okay? So how can you show that it's a group which is under the protected group test? Because only if that group is destroyed would the person be penalized for genocide, okay? So that group, how is the group defined? You have that in an Akayesu test, which says any group which is basically stable and permanent could be called a protected group as per the genocide definition, which is found in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Same article has been lifted and put in the Rome Statute. Ditto. Jus cogens. Same hai. Kahin nahi change hota. Legality. Is clear. Precise. Okay. Then you have 4 or 5 types of actus reus. You can see within the definition that when you kill a particular group's members, when you actually forcibly induct harm upon them, when you actually deliberately inflict harm, when any sort of birth control measures, when you have any sort of these issues, okay, of forcibly transferring the children of one group, child soldiers, all of these issues come from actus reus, 4 to 5 actus reus, which are included there. The next thing in genocide, which is important, so you can just read Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, it will list down those acts. So there's nothing more to it than that, okay? Now, apart from this, you have something which is called the dolus specialis. That's the special mens rea. This mens rea makes the crime distinct, from crime against humanity or a communal riot. Jahan dolus specialis aa gayi, iska matlab, you are just not going and committing mass crimes and mass murders. When a mass murder is committed, when an ethnic cleansing is committed with the sole motive of terminating and targeting a specific group in whole or in a substantial part, that's when the group becomes genocide. Okay? Yes, Kashmiri Pandits, classic case of genocide. I'm myself one. That's a classic case of genocide. However, having said that, it never achieved the status of genocide because most of the times, what I was telling you, the state will dilute it as a communal riot. State kabhi admit ही नहीं करेगा कि ये international armed conflict है. State will always say it's a non-international armed conflict or a NAYAC or an internal communal riot at best. It will never say it has achieved the threshold of genocide. That's the tricky bit, Satya. Okay? I hope I've answered your question. Okay, Satya? So in all such situations where you're targeting groups, what happened in Godhra was a classic case of genocide. Okay? Classic case of genocide. Article 720 of the Rome Statute asserts deportation or forcible transfer of population is a crime against humanity. So how can the defense of Myanmar be accepted? Who is this? Satyam Bhardwaj. Satyam, forcible transfers are very different. Crimes against humanity and genocides are two very distinct issues. Genocide has a dolus specialis. They are removing Rohingyan Muslims. It's not like they are forcibly deporting or transporting X number of persons. That's one. Number two, that's exactly the Myanmar defense, that it's technically just those people being taken away from here, not with the intention of eliminating the group. When Article 7.1d will make that as a separate crime against humanity, that's exactly their point. But we are saying, no, it's not just forcibly deporting. It's forcibly deporting with the intent of eliminating. Read Eichmann's case. It will become crystal clear. Eichmann's case was interesting because actually 1941 was the cutoff date that was given. I'm just answering his question, guys. You can listen to it until then. There was a very interesting case. Eichmann actually had committed a lot of persecutions against Jews. Okay, and it was held that pre-1941 he just wanted the Jews to be removed from German soil. He just didn't want Jews to be around. But after 1941, that ethnic cleansing intent had turned into a genocidal intent, because not only did he want those Muslims to be removed, but he also wanted those Muslims to be eliminated completely. So when you look at Jews to be eliminated completely, so when you look at this, when you're talking just about forcible transfer or deportation, that's fine, the act, but you're actually also having other acts alongside, like shoot at site orders, destroy all mosques, all the Rohingya refugee camps, etc., shoot at site. So when it's accompanied with all of this, you have something called a contextual element. Satyam, this is very high standard ICL, and I didn't want to go into this technically. Okay, Anmol, these are all questions which are very technically high standard ICL. If I go into this, let me just complete my topic for today in like literally 2 minutes, and then I'll take up all these questions. Okay, just 2 minutes. Let me finish this. It's 6:28 by my watch. I'll be done, and then I'll take up all these questions. Okay. So Satyam, I hope you've understood your question. There is something called a contextual element. Okay, you have to look at the context of the crime, and that's a part of the ICC elements of crime, which is called a manifest pattern. Okay, I'm just answering it because you had asked this. This is technically quite high level genocide question. Okay, but have you understood, Satyam? You have to look at the other acts also. It's not just an act in isolation of transporting. वो ठीक है, कोई दिक्कत नहीं है. So read Eichmann's case. It will tell you when that intent to forcibly transfer or deport turns into a genocidal intent, when it's accompanied with all of that. Okay. Chavishri, I'll take all those questions a little later. Just hang in there. Let me finish first, guys. Okay, 2 minutes and I'll take the questions one by one. Okay, so I told you guys this. I want to end with telling you that there are two sort of landmark or watershed moments, okay, within the discussion of genocide, which are crucial to us. One is Godhra riots 2002. The other is, of course, the anti-Sikh riots judgment, okay, Sajjan Kumar's judgment, which has come out in 2019, and 18 was the aftermath. Okay, 19 was the aftermath. And it's currently also some issues are going on, like witnesses have turned hostile and they have challenged the veracity of the deposition in the High Court, okay? So that's still going on. So Godhra riots 2002 was a CBI investigation. Basically, that Sabarmati Express, which was carrying Hindus, was burnt down, as a result of which and they were actually burned down. What was treated out and made out judgment, and of course the state, it was like a terror, almost like a sexual violence being used as a creation of terror weapon, and state, Modi was then CM, state was quiet, and therefore this was said distinct from genocide, like what I'd answered to Satyam's question. I don't think destroy. I have scale, I have gravity, I'm killing X number of people. That's an indiscriminate attack. Okay, I'm not choosing and picking belong to that target of your ethnic nationality. I'm not picking that. Okay? So Godhra riots, I'm not sure if this is good law. Clearly it's not. And it should have reached an aftermath of being genocidal in nature. So international criminal law experts criticize it and say this is wrong. It was literally shielding the person in a way. Okay. Additionally, you had the anti-Sikh riots judgment, which has come out from the Delhi High Court. This has also flown to be a crime against humanity instance, even though Sikhs were targeted, Sardars were targeted, and because there was Indira Gandhi's assassination that had happened, they were targeted as an aftermath of that in 1984, as a result of which, again, court held, Delhi High Court said that, look, it looks to be a case of crime against humanity. They still didn't label it as genocide, but they recommended to the Law Commission, this is the last development, where they recommended to the Law Commission that, look, go and formulate a law on a mass murder, a crime against humanity. So a mass murder would be a crime against humanity. When that crime against humanity is targeted against a specific group, by virtue of you being of that group, you are being specifically targeted. That's the intention, to eliminate your existence and your group's existence, your faction's existence. Sorry, that is called dolus specialis, leads to genocide. So that's the gradation. Okay, now let's take your questions. Chavishri says, who can be prosecuted in ICC for genocide? Individual groups, organizations, or governments. So it's always individuals. Chavi, it's always individuals. It's individual criminal liability. If you're in the state zone, if you're in a state-like zone, Montevideo Convention, you have public international law walking in, go to ICJ, International Court of Justice. Okay, sits at The Hague, literally about a mile away from the ICC building. Literally, it's the same walkway which leads to the beach at the end. Okay, it's literally on the same road. But no, individual criminal liability, only individuals who are heads of states, not even terrorists or unorganized groups. Okay, Chavi, is that clear? Okay, let's go up and scroll. A question or two was there upstairs. Okay, ma'am, but is it the standard state's acceptance of an armed conflict? Why is the OTP never proprio moto acted in the case of Kashmir despite decades of turmoil? Excellent question, Anmol. But India is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. So how can proprio moto investigation kick in? That's one. Number two, we don't recognize them to be that particular threshold, which is technically not possible to be commented on by upon an external state, because we don't allow them to come on our soil. Out somebody from the OTP's office to come and investigate the issue in India, whether it's the threshold or not would be an independent report required of Amnesty International or a particular international organization. But we are not allowing anyone to come in and investigate. That allowance itself is a breach of our state sovereignty. We haven't allowed that as well. So how can they comment? There has to be some credible information. Proprio motu doesn't mean that whatever prosecutor receives blindly as an intimation, he has to in the PTC hearing first justify. And at the United Nations level, we have maintained that Kashmir is an integral part of India. It is a NIAC. It is a non-international armed conflict. There is no disputed territory. There's no human rights violation which have reached the threshold. That's our international stand. So then who proves otherwise? You need someone to come and investigate and with proof submit on an international platform that no, there are mass human rights violations happening. This is why countries like China, etc., which are iron curtains, we have no clue how they are treating their people. Even for that matter, when the corona issue happened, there were so many news where people are being picked and they're chosen literally, and they are being shot at by the government. You have no idea what the government's doing with respect to human rights violations unless the government lets an independent entity walk in and justify. Is that clear, Anmol? That's a good question, but A, we haven't signed the Rome Statute, and if proprio motu from the prosecutor were to kick in, he needs some credible information to justify before the PTC hearing. And for that, India is to allow someone from the OTP office to come in or an independent agency to come in and formulate that particular opinion based on cogent evidence. We are not allowing that. We've shut our door. We're a state sovereign. We are protecting our sovereignty. Okay. Rahul Prasad has asked something. Before that, there's another question. Okay. If there is an amendment made to the IPC regarding a new provision for genocide, it still would be not have retrospective effect on Sajjan Kumar, right? Yes, legality would never have. Okay. Penal law is always strictly interpreted. Any penal statute always, and any remedial statute is beneficially interpreted. So penal statute can never ever be retrospectively interpreted. Fiscal statutes can be. Okay, Rahul Prasad, Rishabh Joshi. Ma'am, whether ethnic cleansing can take place within the same state? Yes, most definitely. Can the forced migration of Kashmiri Pandits be termed as ethnic cleansing? Absolutely, yes. I would say not even ethnic cleansing, it was literally genocidal. Ethnic cleansing is just forced migration. But I think that had somewhere turned to even killing them. There was a specific intent to destroy the whole group. Okay, so this is a matter to be justified in court with evidence. How? there is a now that you've asked, I will answer it. It's called a purpose-based approach, guys. This is collated by direct and circumstantial evidence and surrounding acts, other acts. So you have direct evidence. पहले तो directly देखो क्या है, circumstantial देखो क्या available है. उसके बाद other acts, like अगर mosques target हो रहे हैं, Muslim refugee camps target हो रहे हैं, then it's showing an added criminal intent for targeting only that group. So this is all circumstantial and other evidence. Okay, so this is also looked at, but this of course is a backdoor for opening evidentiary systematic problems which could crop up. Okay, but this is some sort of reliance on that issue when you see the holistic picture. Okay, so I think we have reached a 6:40. Ashwini, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
There's another question. Wait, I'm just going to take this last question. Recently, on January 23rd, the ICC has taken cognizance, because that's from Bangladesh. I was just going to tell you that. Ordered Myanmar to take all of necessary measures against Muslims. Killing has been reported after that. How do you evaluate the order and response? So yes, this has been a black dot on Myanmar. Who is this? Suhail. Okay. So Suhail's brought up a good point. He said that the ICJ has recently commented. And I just want to add to this, Suhail. ICC has also been approached by Bangladesh. Okay, because Bangladesh is a signatory to the Rome Statute. And some of the refugees from Myanmar have come and sought refuge in Bangladesh, like they have in India. There are certain Rohingyan Muslims who've also gone to Bangladesh, so good number. Okay, so that's interesting, because I think it's absolutely right of the ICJ, but this particular reporting and this particular system is based on the UNHRC, OHRC documents, which are not binding. So this particular liability or responsibility assessment, until and unless you hold that lady, probably that Aung San Suu Kyi, that Nobel laureate, unless you hold that lady who was in power in Burma liable for these issues personally, nothing tangible is going to come out of it. And in practice, without a monitoring mechanism, because the enforceability of monitoring mechanism again will require state authorities. वो तो खुद Myanmar government की होंगी, तो implement कैसे करोगे? It's going to be difficult. It's not so easy. Rome Statute is a machinery which also rests on country cooperation. ICJ decision of Kulbhushan Jadhav came. But how do we know how he's being kept there? Is he on sedatives? Is he actually fine? He gets consular access also. But after he gets consular access, after his family sees him for probably half an hour, we don't know the condition he's being kept in. So to implement international law decisions becomes manifestly difficult. Okay, I hope I've answered your question, Sohail. Yes. Somebody asked me about refugee law and humanitarian law to end. I'm just going to end with that discussion. So primarily what happens is that under the Refugee Convention, there is a principle of non-refoulement. Okay, so Article 1 defines a refugee. So whenever someone comes to a particular country, first you seek asylum. First, you are an asylum seeker. You haven't attained the status of a refugee. Only when the court actually says that, look, you have sought asylum, you have been given asylum, now we declare you as a refugee. That's the second step. As a refugee, you get equivalent rights to the citizens to the extent of certain basic rights like right to life, etc. Okay, certain non-derogable rights which cannot even be abrogated during, say, a 359, an emergency. Those rights flow down to you akin a citizen. So a country like India, which doesn't have resources enough for its own citizens, doesn't want to induct more refugees. So all these Rohingyan Muslims are still at the stage of asylum seekers. We haven't signed the Refugee Convention. We refuse to, and that's why we've not given them the status of being refugees still. Okay, because if they were to be refugees, then there is a principle of non-refoulement, which means if those refugees were to face human rights violations in their own country, we will not send them back. We will give them refuge here like a citizen. So that's a huge flaw. So my job used to be to vet those applications that would come from Turkish nationals and all of those places. My job would be to see that and then see. Yes, non-refoulement basically is customary international law. That is why we are not able to do anything. We are feeding them, keeping them in refugee camps, and looking at a plausible solution, Chavishri, of something called deportation with assurances. This is the solution, ultimately, that we are going to have to send back all these Rohingyan Muslims, deporting them back to Myanmar, like the Abu Qatada case. You guys can read this. Okay. And that's exactly how it becomes more interesting. ICL, of course, is important along with Refugee Convention because ICL is the heads of states who have caused that particular movement, that forced migration, that ethnic cleansing. So first you have to go and justify whether it's a genocide or an ethnic cleansing or not, whether they will face that kind of persecution if they are sent back. Kavita Mohanty, ma'am, it's very logical. ICL and refugee law will be interrelated, okay? Very, very basic to that extent, but just to clarify the point again, okay? Okay, Anmol. The long question. No problem, ma'am. The long question. Anmol, what is your question? Knowledge and intent are different. Yes. Knowledge is basically very, very distinct from intent. Intent is my purpose-based approach. One is motive. This is too detailed ICL, but I can still sort of discuss with specifically you. But you can, for a broad knowledge, know that now the test under the ICC is not a knowledge-based approach. Now it's a purpose-based approach. The test for genocide is now not, what is your name? Anmol, I think. Anmol. Now the test for genocide, okay, is specific intent, is not what we call as knowledge. Now knowledge is not important. Now purpose-based approach is important. Now when it comes to intent, I have to show discriminatory intent. That becomes my motive. So now knowledge is not important to that extent. Knowledge is in modes of liability. I'll go into too much of ICL if I talk about this right now. It's completely different. Knowledge is when, as a superior and command responsibility principle, you have knowledge of the commission of the crime, or you failed to omit the commission, the crime from being committed, and that omission or commission has led. That's the knowledge aspect and mode of liability. We've moved away from that. The intent is the discriminatory intent, which flows from a purpose-based approach. So that's the in the shortest format I can put for you, okay, as a material element, okay. How is the label of genocide granted? And who grants it? Please stop chatting in the pop bubble to answer. I've pretty much given that answer, guys. The label of genocide is actually granted by the ICC, okay? It's literally the International Criminal Court, OTP, Office of the Prosecutor, Rishabh, who will assess whether it has reached that threshold or not, okay? So that flows, and secondly, that will flow from the Genocide Convention, Article 2, enshrined in the Rome Statute. So the OTP has the burden of proof of justifying if that genocide has happened as per article of the Rome Statute. Okay, the Article 6 of the Rome Statute, which is akin to Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. So you have actus reus there, dolus specialis there, and the fact that there are protected groups. Okay, so I'm going to close with this. We're really running out of time. I think I have pretty much taken everyone's question. Ashwini, over to you. I've pretty much taken all the questions.